So David was incensed that Goliath had mocked Israel's army and their God. Goliath was a huge, skilled veteran warrior, and some have postulated that he had hereditary pituitary disorder, a form of gigantism. He and his family were large people and particularly skilled fighters. And one of his sons even came close to killing David later on. So this story shows that David, against the recommendation of the older Saul, used judgment, vision, and truth to guide his actions. Israel and Philistine had been at war with each other for 700 years, from about 1300 to 600 BC. There were 7 major battles recorded in the Old Testament. The Battle of Shephelah, 2 Chronicles 28, the Battle of Aphek, 1 Samuel 4, the Battle of Ezez, 1 Samuel 7, the battles at Michmash, 1 Samuel 14, the battle between David and Goliath, 1 Samuel 17, the battle at Mount Gilboa, 1 Samuel 31, and finally Hezekiah's defeat of the Philistines in 2 Kings 18. These battles were fought on at least 2 accounts. The first battle was a battle of worldviews. The second battle was a battle for fertile land. The Valley of Elah was a fertile valley and still is today. And I've been reading Tom Holland's book, Dominion, where he tracks the impact of Judeo-Christian worldview on the world. He shows the reader that life was harsh, filled with continuous conflict, slavery, subterfuge, murder, and the list goes on. While the word genocide didn't exist until last century, there were very definitely instances where one tribe or nationality would annihilate another for their land. I'm unsure we can judge those people and conflicts by our standards because their reality was kill or be killed. So what's obvious is how the Judeo-Christian worldview started to not just diverge, but to oppose convention. Abram was called to worship one God, where the world around him worshipped many gods. Abram stopped child sacrifice, where the world around him routinely killed their children. Jesus told his disciples to love their enemies. Paul showed the Christians that they could invite non-Christians, non-Jews into God's family. Paul instructed his disciples Timothy and Titus that leaders should be chosen based on their character, being faithful to one wife and bringing their children up in the faith. Jesus elevated the status of women by trusting women with the news of his resurrection, in a context where women's testimony was not counted as valid. And there's so much more. And this and so much more led directly to increasing enlightenment, liberty, flourishing of the world, starting with the Jews up until today throughout the world. So not just has the Judeo-Christian worldview brought about flourishing, but possibly as important, it has shown us how to endure suffering. These two have directly produced enlightenment. Exceptionally bright philosophers have tried to produce worldviews that rival Judeo-Christian worldview. But the ideas are largely influenced by Christianity and have faded. One of the brightest of those philosophers, Immanuel Kant, was deeply moved by his parents' faith, but had the impression that their worldview required too much faith and not enough reason. Kant explored the possibility of virtue without religion, and it's a wonderful idea, but it's also preposterous. His best idea, in my estimation, was based on the Golden Rule, and it was called the categorical imperative. Kant was deeply influenced by Christian faith, and so many of his statements are more complex statements of Christian principles. So I say preposterous because reason and intellect are amoral. They're tools, and tools need to be guided by functions, such as a hammer being used to build a house or taking apart a table. While a hammer is ideally used to knock nails into wood or to shape metal, people have used hammers to commit murder. And intellect is the same. It may be rational to euthanize people with hereditary disease because doing so limits the impact of the disease. And in that line of thinking, it may be functional to euthanize people with intellectual problems. That is wrong. Unanchored principles, reason, unanchored is like fire outside a fireplace. And here in Cape Town, we've had the recent experience of the devastating effects of fire. So the two armies, Israel and Philistine, seemed almost matched on the day, although possibly tilting towards the Philistines. And in this story, Saul wanted David to fight with conventional warrior armor. Some say Saul should have fought Goliath, but by that account then, the Philistine leader should have fought as well. That said, it was not uncommon to decide battles by sending the best warriors from each side to fight. David, based on his experience in the wild tending to his sheep, had the insight to know that fighting in someone else's armor was not going to benefit him. He intuitively knew that the armor probably would not assist him and would likely hinder his style of physical confrontation. David was agile, well rehearsed in using a slingshot. In Judges 20 verse 16, it tells us that skilled sling shooters could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Imagine. The battle was over before it had started. David then hacked off Goliath's head and showed it to the onlooking armies. David's battle is within a context of Israel's battles with the Philistines, a battle for the Judeo-Christian worldview, developing virtues against a context of depravity, light against dark, salvation against sin, love against self-aggrandizement and revenge. I'm not the first to say we are in a period of endarkenment. Things fall apart of their own accord, but the sins of men speed their deterioration. That's a quote from Jordan Peterson's latest book. Intellect can be used to obfuscate, control, and deceive, and it's hard to navigate in the world when we don't know the truth. A car can land in a lake, and I'm sure you know of examples of this, when the driver trusts the GPS too much and his perception and interpretation too little. In a context where intellect is used onward from faith in God, the first principle of sovereignty, we are called to live out deliberately, to live out the golden rule, to love and to seek out the flourishing of those around us. Mutual flourishing comes about by deliberate actions in the face of self-sacrifice, resentment, anger, and betrayal. Faith in the sovereignty of God is the guiding star for flourishing. When Jesus showed up, he taught his disciples that God was his Father and their Father. He taught them that God was for them, for their flourishing, no matter what the circumstance. I think the importance of the role of the Father is one of the most important realizations that we've had in the Christian faith. In my research, I'm concerned with men's health. Well, it's one of the things that I'm concerned with. And men are a vulnerable group. And particularly in South Africa, we have the highest global rates of premature mortality for those under the age of 35 years. Many problems in our context are related to not having a father in the home. Not having a father can make it harder to think rationally, harder to relate to others and make trusting relationships, and harder to flourish. Obviously, this isn't a rule that fatherlessness causes tragedy in all fatherless children. It's undeniable that a loving father who provided for the family is associated with fewer adverse outcomes in life and a greater level of flourishing than not having a father. We're constantly reminded to take care of orphans and widows in the scriptures. To use different words, we should take care of children without parents and women without husbands. We should do our best to reduce misery, love practically and in words, and seek out the flourishing of those in our communities. So, in our tradition, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and particularly in the Anglican Church, we have a long tradition of the most renowned philosophers and priests and fathers. In a context of depravity and bad teaching, there are many good men for us to emulate. So, this reflection led me to think about what do we do? For us as Christians, this means we should tithe. We should offer our time and our labor to organizations, starting with trustworthy churches. There are so many I'm struck by how many salt and light people there are doing this right now. So find those people and emulate them. Father, thank you that you are a good Father, that you are good to us and that you will be good to us.